delighted to introduce our facilitator for tonight. But first, before I do that, I want to draw your attention to a couple of housekeeping items. We are going to be tweeting tonight. Our Director of Communications is live tweeting tonight, and we also ask you to tweet tonight as well. And so you can tweet with the hashtag RJWebinars, so capital R, capital J, webinars. And so please tweet with that hashtag, and if you have questions, you can also tweet them to us as well. If you have any technical issues with being able to hear the webinar or see the webinar, our Director of Communications is also behind the scenes monitoring, so you can send issues or questions in the chat box, as well as questions about any of the content that is going to be on the webinar tonight. So we are going to leave some time after our presenter does her thing tonight for questions and comments. And so if you do have those, please submit those, and we will try to get to as many as we can within the hour. All right, without further ado, I want to introduce to you all Cecilia Olusola Tribble. She has an MTS from Vanderbilt, graduated in 2011, and also has a master's in performance studies from NYU. And she's going to tell us a little bit more about what she's doing right now professionally in the arts world in Nashville, where she lives. And then we're going to just launch right into the conversation tonight about how we can use liturgy to take us through ritual and help us to make meaning out of reproductive justice issues across the spectrum, and particularly how we can use ritual as an act of resistance in our current political climate. So I will turn it over to her and let her share with us all that she has to share tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Kentina. It is hold on, I think I did that wrong.
Oh, to share
my main screen, hold on. No, I don't want it to do that. Hold on. How do I go back?
If you go back to sharing, it should tell you to, you should be able to, let me see if I can do it here on my screen. It's going to be, click on sharing, and then just put, instead of where the drop down shows screen, you can just show yourself there.
I see, okay.
See it? Okay.
Sharing. Wait a minute. Show. It's not saying self. It's saying main screen. Well, it's okay if you guys don't mind.
Oh, there you are. I think it went away. So I think it's just you now.
Okay. It's
yes.
Just me now. Okay.
Looks like it.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and I'm excited to talk with you all tonight about reproductive justice. I really, as I was sharing with Kentina, I'm really not an expert at any of this. I'm really a practitioner and a person who seeks solace and helps and does my best to help facilitate that with and for other people like that. So I basically have suggestions and practices that have been a help to me, and I'm really looking forward to the conversational part of this webinar so we can hear what you guys are talking about, and I definitely want to make this a talk back. There are a couple of elements that I have really leaned on in terms of creating ritual, and perhaps I should go into what I mean by ritual and why it's important, and particularly for me as a spiritual person, as a religious person, but also as an African American person. I think that ritual is something that really says a lot about our faith in the performative, right? It helps worlds that currently do not exist in the present, right? So there is a kind of futurity in creating ritual and doing that ritual with other people or even with yourself, right? You're connecting yourself to a power source that is greater than yourself, right? Greater is the one that is within than the one that is in the world, in a sense. So ritual is super important in that way. Um, so the first element I would like to talk about is really an examination period, and particularly when speaking to reproductive justice and the myriad of ways that hits home, where whether or not we're talking about um, birth or death or abortion, voluntary or involuntary, pregnancy, consensual or non-consensual sex, or um, even getting older and transitioning through menopause, or even if it's you were born one way and identify in another gender, and you still need to make sure your parts are in good and working order. Um, reproduct all of those things, we have to examine what we think and believe, and to make sure what we think and believe are congruent with how we act in the world. And so, what I mean is, what is your theology really? And how do you shape language around what is most important? So, for me, and this will look different for everybody. What is most important is that I believe that God desires for me to be healthy, right? And for me to be whole. And I believe that God desires that for other people, right? And that I should do my best to facilitate other people being healthy and whole in the world. I believe I am a Christian, and so I believe that Jesus came to to show us the way to abundant life. And so, how I think about reproductive justice are through these two lenses, right? Are the decisions that I'm making or helping somebody else to make, and the words I say around those decisions, do they facilitate health of all parties involved, safe, healthy, affordable, etc., and do they promote abundant life? Secondly, um, secondly, I believe in drawing on the traditions that has helped you carry you through thus far. I'm a preacher's kid. Both my parents are ministers and pastors, and uncle and brother and aunts and grandparents, great grandparents, everybody's in the church. And so some of those old songs always help when um, drawing solace. So what I'm thinking of is "Pass Me Not, O Gentle Savior." If it's not that for you, perhaps it's "Blessed Assurance" or "Amazing Grace." But "Precious Lord," right? The songs, the old songs of the saints. There's something about performing Um, songs that have been sung over and over again that have given other people power that then give you power, right? In order to endure um, to the next thing, right? Um, Looking over my notes here. Thirdly, I believe in expanding the traditions where they fall short. I think we, in many ways, we have to wrestle with the ways in which certain religious heritage is harmful and oppressive, and would um, um, not promote abundant life or health in all situations, right? And we have to come to grips with those things and resist those things and then come up with new language, right? So, for example, my son was just blessed in the company of our friends and family in our house, and the pastor asked what sort of language he should use in order to talk about God. And I had to share with him, my beliefs about God are that God is mother and father, our holy parent, our creator. And so for me, that is a way to expand the tradition that has given me strength and has been a source of strength for my family, but also not inflicting harm and seeing God as a patriarch, right? Which, yeah. In the past, I have. I write prayers and liturgies and litanies for other people for different kinds of things. And for myself, I think it's always helpful to take out your journal and write that prayer and to recite that prayer. For some of my Catholic friends, they've said the rosary, and perhaps the words that are in the rosary aren't helpful, but perhaps the act of holding the beads and saying a new prayer over and over again will empower you to make a decision or to help someone else be healthy and have abundant life. Fourth is to honor your story and the stories of others, and to worship and liturgy is an emotional thing for many people. I know that it is for me. People scream and holler out and dance sometimes, or just sit in the corner crying because they have joy or deep sadness, or perhaps they don't know how they feel. And I find that with a myriad of issues when it comes to reproductive justice, we have to really sit with discomfort, because at the end of it, we're talking about bodies and bodies that have been demonized over and over again for centuries and millennia, right? And we have to sit with joy, sadness, mourning, perhaps, not quite understanding our situation, and yet being present in it. And so to be able to honor that is to sometimes really being present in the moment and not brushing it aside. I think that lingering, what some of the old saints call tarrying in some traditions, to tarry in that moment, is a way of honoring your story and honoring the stories of others. And lastly, I believe in communion, right? And to have communion of all sorts, the Bible says that Jesus told his disciples to do this in remembrance of me. As often as you do it in remembrance of me. And I think that communion can be not just, the little wafer and the juice or whatever, but to really remember that, only in a sense in our brokenness, in Christ's brokenness, we are made whole, right? And to break bread and to give thanks, even in discomfort or comfort or relief or joy, or even extreme sadness. Breaking bread and giving thanks always keeps us grounded in the movement and the struggle, in private, in public, whether we're on the street performing this ritual as a resistance of we are together, we will break bread together and give thanks. is something that we should always do. So as far as the 5 things that I really think about when creating ritual, um, in general, but rituals specifically around issues of reproductive justice, I always do an examination um, of the theology. I rely on my traditions because that's what's got me through. I expand on new traditions to make sure the language fits with what I believe now and that promote healthy and abundant life. I what's the fourth one? What's the fourth one? I honor, we honor the story and sit with discomfort, right? And lastly, we have communion often, and break bread and drink wine and give thanks. And so that's all I have to say.
Well, thank you. That was great, and I was feverishly taking notes because I have questions for discussion, and we may have some from our audience here too. So I think that Drew will let us know. But I really one of the things that you said at the very beginning of your talk. I'm going to put my camera on here. Um, at the very beginning of your remarks was about the futurity in creating ritual, thinking about what it means to talk about what is and what is yet to be. Those of us that are from Christian traditions, we hear about this all of the time in the Hebrews text where we talk about the ancestors that prayed for that world which they may not have seen. And I'm certain that those similar themes exist in some of our um, sibling faith traditions, Jewish and Unitarian Universalist specifically. Those are the other two faith traditions that we do a lot of work with here at the Religious Institute. So I really appreciated that, this futuristic kind of the hoping for the world to come, hoping for things to be better. One thing that stuck out to me as well, in your first point about examination, you mentioned a lot of different concerns that come up around reproductive justice, and sometimes we hear specifically just about abortion, and we know that as women of color, particularly, that reproductive justice is not just about access to abortion. That is but one element under this entire umbrella of so many uh, elements that are there for people to be able to decide to have children, to not have children, and if they do have children, to be able to raise them in a safe and equitable environment. But one thing you brought up, and I've been thinking about this, I just wrote an article recently about sexuality in older adults. You talked about menopause. And you talked about, you mentioned that as one of the losses or transitions that a woman may experience in her life or will experience in her life at some point, whether it's because of aging or other health concerns that might even bring it on early for her. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit more about um, a particular sort of niche issue like menopause, like the changing woman's body, and how we might liturgically respond to that in our congregations, particularly as our congregations are aging,
Right.
and women are dealing with this issue.
Well, I think that the body changing is an issue that is um, universal is not the word I want to use because it's so cliche, but but everybody can identify with change, right? And I think for older women in particular, it can be a positive or a negative because of the ways in which we make fun of older women. They're not, in some ways, they're not seen as beautiful. They're not as valuable. Um, but so the rituals that we can create around changing out, changing into a new part of one's life can really be beautiful, right? Because when you move on from one stage to another, you know more, right?
Hmm.
You're able to there are experiences that you're able to pass on, or hold on to your hold on to, that you're that you have as a result of moving on, right? And so um, again, about honoring your story and the stories that you collect along the way, um, whether it's a story sharing, or a special prayer of thanksgiving, of I was there, but now I'm here, and thank God for keeping me through.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, there are all kinds of. I mean, that's really a general answer. I
Hmm.
mean, if you want me to be more specific about, what, sure, I can do that. But I really think that the rituals one creates um, really has to be for that community,
Yes.
or for that person, right? Um, yeah, but it's about honoring that story about, I was there, but now I'm here,
Hmm.
and thank God, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that storytelling is so important. And one of the things that I've been thinking about this year, specifically when we've been, frankly, working a lot around religious resistance to this administration and to the what seem like continual attacks on reproductive justice and reproductive access and choice and health, is reclaiming the narratives from those who seek to tell the stories
Right.
of women of color in particular, and why women of color make the decisions or don't make the decisions related to their reproductive health, and reproductive justice, and why those decisions, sometimes that decision making is taken away from them because of systemic um, issues that they have no control over. And so it's been really important to talk a lot about story. We had a campaign earlier this year where we were collecting stories from people who had had positive experiences with Planned Parenthood, and they wanted to share that they had been cared for in a dignified and way, when they really needed that care, and talking personally about those stories. And so I appreciated tonight, as you've said, you've reiterated to us about telling your stories, drawing on the wells of tradition, the songs or prayers or scriptures. And I think that though you're speaking specifically from your experience as a Christian, I think that these are themes that are applicable across the faith traditions. We are a multi faith organization, so we're working with not only Christian folk, but also Jewish folk and Unitarian Universalist folk as well. And I think that it's that these themes around story, around what are those songs or prayers or sayings, meditations that have carried you through
Right.
throughout your life, are absolutely applicable across the board. Can you talk a little more about point three, where you talked about expanding traditions where they fall short, and maybe give some examples where you've seen that? I know you talked a little bit about your son and his baby blessing, and expanding some language there to be a bit more holistic in how you look at God in your life and in your son's life. Can you talk more about maybe your own experiences in ministry or in congregations where, particularly around issues of reproductive justice, where language has needed to be expanded to be more inclusive?
Yeah. The Well, I'll speak directly to, the violent language against abortion,
Uh-huh.
and the Ten Commandments being used as a weapon against that. And um, again, as a person who has fought all of my, consciously, for access to birth control, access to abortion, when it's something that I have struggled with personally, and something that my parents, who are both pastors and way more conservative than I am, had to help me along with, and that's where that abundant life language comes from, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of the God that we put God into a box, and but God doesn't live just in the Bible, and God doesn't just live in our box or what we imagine God is, but God desires for us to be happy, healthy, and whole, and to have abundant life, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think that comes in counseling. I think that comes in perhaps private prayer between a minister and a person that minister is counseling. That
Mm-hmm.
comes in that comes from the pulpit, right? And that comes in the preaching moment
Mm-hmm.
of affirming that no matter what decision one makes, God is always with us, and God always desires for us to be whole, right? Um, and I think that's true no matter what faith tradition you come from, right? That God desires for us to be whole and healthy. So, yeah.
It's good. Thank you. Um, there was one more thing that I was thinking about. I just this notion of language, I think, is so important.
Hmm.
Language has so much power, and you talked about violent language associated with abortion as an example.
Yeah.
Imagining what it might be for somebody who's sitting in a pew or in a chair in a faith space to hear violent language coming from the pulpit or around them, people talking, someone who has had to make that decision or is on the fence about making that decision. And you talked about decision making in your first point when you talked about examination, having an examination period or examining your theology, and how decision making should facilitate the health of all parties involved, and if the language that we're using to walk with people through this decision is either helping or harming them.
Right.
Um, and I wonder if you might share a little bit with us about this theology piece. I think that as I've been doing this work in reproductive justice just over the last year in a more pointed way in this role, prior to this role, I was a chaplain, a hospital chaplain, so I had sat with many, many women and families who were experiencing reproductive losses of all sorts and all types and reproductive decisions.
Right.
And so being on this side of it, I have had that experience, but now I'm on this side of it doing more kind of education and outreach and preparing clergy to deal with how do they provide care and how do they preach and how do they
Right.
teach about this in their congregations. I wonder for you, and this is something that makes me think about my theology every day, when you're on the ground doing this work and you're having to really confront your own feelings, thoughts, places that you're unsure. And I wonder for you, as someone who's gone to div school, who is an artist as well, and who has done this work, who's a parent of a young Black child in the United States of America. Can you talk a little bit about the intersection for you of your role as Black woman, as mother, as minister, as artist, in how you are looking at theology related to reproductive justice?
Yeah. Wow, that was a lot. So, no,
Sorry.
it's all good. All good. So I think as artists, as minister, as activist, as theologian, um, and now as a parent. I think that this theology again is lived, right?
Mhm.
And no matter the the people I come across, my story then becomes intertwined with theirs. I have to tell you that, being pregnant with as a Black person with a Black baby is heavy. It was heavy,
Mhm.
you know, and something that I wrestled with theologically, when I first found out I was pregnant. It's just like, why would I bring a child into this world
Mhm.
that is, always seeking to destroy Black people? Um, and yet I have this, I'm older. There was a time in my life I wasn't ready for that at all. And I did not have the support in order to carry that through. And so the results were different, and I made a different decision. And so, but now that I'm older, I have a different support system. Um, it's just like, well, I can do this. I am able to be um, the kind of parent that um, God desires for me to be, that I would want to be the best parent possible. Um, and I have this great joy in my life. So I say all of that to say is that theology is performed and lived,
Mhm.
and um, and sometimes your decisions will be different based on what decision situation you're in, right? And I think for ministers and activists and artists, I think it's important to not judge the people we come encounter with, right? Just because their situation is different, our experience is different, it's important to. I think we talk a lot about judging as we judge other people, and we also judge ourselves, right? Um,
Yes.
And so I think it's important to, even as, you have your story, you live your theology, you live your truth, you perform your theology and your truth. It is important not to judge someone else and to help them through, right? And that's what's always tricky, right? How
Mhm.
do I help them without judging them? How do I help me without judging me? So that's the and and wrestling with all of our social conditions and you know awfulness happening, but also beauty happening. I think that if our traditions teach us anything, is that um, beauty and beauty comes from the the depths, right? They are pulled out of deep despair, um, and so as an artist, as a theologian, as a mom, as an activist, that's something that I always have to think of, right?
Mhm.
That hope is even the residue of hope we thought had died
Mhm.
is helping us to yet become.
So you've been to Div School and
Yeah,
you've been to to NYU for your artist life. Tell
yeah.
me a little bit about. We do a lot of work. I do a lot of work with seminarians, people who are trying to figure out if they want to do this ministry thing and what that's going to look like post seminary, post Div School. I know that I feel like everything I learned about liturgy, at least in the rudimentary sort of stages, I learned in seminary, experiencing worship that I had not experienced before, being able to plan worship and participate, writing prayers, doing rituals in my chaplaincy internships, etc. Can you talk a little bit for folks who might be watching who are either currently in seminary or div school or rabbinical school right now, or have been formed in those spaces? What your experiences were like when you were in seminary, liturgically, around issues of reproductive justice, if at all, and what, where there might be room to grow, where there definitely is room to grow.
Let's see. I really had a whole head up leg in the game, whatever the expression is. I had some advantages in that both of my parents are pastors and musicians. And so planning worship is something that, my family does in our sleep. But but as a seminarian, it's something that I was always frustrated with, honestly, in terms of including various folks' traditions and trying to honor one tradition, honoring one tradition without doing violence to another, right? It's something that I feel like the people I went to school with, we ended up doing well because we had those clashes, we had those conversations of how do we do this without having sort of the denominational imperialism that was going on before. Also, my first year at Vanderbilt was the first year for the Religion, the Arts, and Contemporary Culture, which is now a certificate there. It was the first year of the grant. And so there were other opportunities to think theologically through art, in songwriting, in thinking about pop culture, and really the pop culture is super, in some ways, more theologically interesting than the traditions of the church, and to think about how God talk exists everywhere.
Yes.
Which is, I guess, the path I have chosen to take now. But as far as planning and planning liturgy, I think you have to have those conversations with your colleagues about what the beliefs are, how do they perform their beliefs, and coming up with a compromise. And then you are, hopefully able to come up with something very beautiful and meaningful for everybody here. I'll say another thing. So at Vanderbilt, we also had various student groups, Black Seminarians, Office of Women's Concerns, the LGBT seminarians group. I'm blanking on whatever we called it there back in the day. Back when I was a student there. I'm not alum now, thank goodness. But I have now graduated. But and so being able to create worship services that honor the various stories that come up in those separate and collective communities, having artistic programming. I was very privileged in and that I got to coordinate some of the programming that would happen through religion, the arts, and contemporary culture, and spoken word and community painting and improvisational art making that were worshipful. So But really, again, to consider and honor everyone's story there, and to expand on the tradition and focus on communion after. Everything's better when you break bread and have some
Yes.
wine.
Um, talking about art as a healing exercise, and you were talking about worship and art. I was thinking about if you might talk a little bit or give some ideas for people who may be interested in more creative or a different kind of creative way to do liturgy. So for some of us, it is sitting in front of a computer and writing some prayers or some liturgical kind of exercises. For other people, it's music. And for other people, it might be actual tactile painting or sculpture
Yeah.
or play. And I have found that painting, I'm not a very artistic person, at least I don't think I am, but painting, when I'm able to make myself sit down and sit still enough to do it, is very therapeutic for me. The brushstrokes each are a prayer or a lament. And so I wonder if you might talk in our last few minutes together a little bit about your orientation in the world as artists, and maybe some ideas or best practices that you've seen when we think about this reproductive justice framework, this resistance to the attacks and the attempts to dismantle and to continue to have Black and brown bodies in particular caught up in systemic oppression around reproductive justice. How might we use art in our faith communities, which sometimes are not very artistic places in that way, for those clergy that might be watching this right now and trying to think about ways to engage their congregations differently? Or do you have some ideas about that?
Yeah. I'll begin philosophically first. So my orientation toward art, I use this statement a lot. Philosopher Emmanuel Levinas talks about art and culture as a part of the ontological order par excellence. They help. They make it possible for us to understand being,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so um, the culture we create as a religion and the things we do in religion, singing, dancing, painting, prayer, as sort of cultural artifacts,
Mm-hmm.
orient us right toward the divine and toward one another. And so I think that when we demystify um, art as a specialty, as the part of product, art as a specialized thing, in a sense, is a product of colonialism and capitalism and white supremacy,
Mm-hmm.
right? When we separate art and culture from the daily happenings of people, we think of old traditions where people weren't, trying to make they didn't think about the beautiful etchings they were carving on a dresser or an altar or their earrings or their stoles. They were trying to keep warm or store their clothes. They weren't necessarily thinking about um, the the 4 5 2 5 harmonic structure, and they weren't thinking about diminished anything. They were trying to express, they were trying to work out their relationship to God and to one another. And
Right.
so I think that when we, in that way, when we separate, um, when we orient ourselves toward art and toward culture in such a way that, oh, I'm a person and therefore am a cultural producer. I'm an artist. I think that helps to give us better access to um, our creative selves. Having said that, as far as reproductive justice is concerned, um, having art be a part of reproductive justice is just what it should be. It is a part of how we tell our story. It's a part of how people, 50, 100, 1,000 years from now, if we're still here, will know us, right? They will know we cared about um, people's right to choose, right?
Yeah.
We cared about whether or not people had safe, legal access to abortion and to cancer screening. We cared whether or not breast pumps were available through health insurance, right? We care about, and so that's just what we have to do. We have to make art because we have to tell our story.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That's so true. Well, we've got a few minutes left, and I know Twitter has been, we've been tweeting much of what you've been saying tonight. Drew has been working hard behind the scenes, and we've had some other folks tweeting and retweeting as well. So when you get a chance to look at your Twitter timeline early or later today, you'll see some information there. But but any final thoughts as we close out today? I mean, I think that your 5 points are so key, and we tweeted those. Really, like I said, I think that they're applicable across the board when we think about storytelling, when we think about looking back over our lives and reaching back to those traditions that have kept us going, whether it's songs, prayers, examining our theology, which we should be doing all the time, making and remaking our theology all the time, telling our stories, and then communion, whether that's literal Christian communion at a table, whether that is just getting together for meals with people who we love and who love us, and feeding one another from our hearts. These are all so integral to this work that we do to craft worship that, as you have reminded us tonight, reminds us of the abundant life that the divine wants for all of us. A life that is full of joy, a life that is full of having all that you need to live and be healthy and happy. And so I wonder, as we draw to a close here tonight, if you had just some final thoughts for the folks that are out here that are thinking about worship that they're planning for this summer. We will go through ebbs and flows with this political drama that we see playing out every day, and people's lives and livelihoods are hanging in the balance. I wonder what you might say to folks as a word of benediction, so to speak.
Well, I'll say to stay prayerful and to really honor the folks in your community, right? And to give everyone an opportunity to create together. I think the summer is, people are traveling, numbers in worship service are down. And so I think that's a perfect opportunity, really, for people who are in charge of worship to really get creative, right? And to to really listen, because there is a time and space there to do so. And so, I think to perhaps have a time of improvisation, of play, of obviously you'll need to. Well, you don't have to, but if you're wanting to have a sort of ebb and flow and opening, a middle portion of focus, of some sort of communing together, and then some words at the end where people are improvising and creating together and telling their story, telling their testimony, being a witness to their testimony, I think is important, um, especially in this work. So stay creative.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for your just wonderful insight tonight, and just reminding us that we are all artists because we are human, and this is part of who we are. It's part of our DNA, and we just have to tap into it and allow ourselves to get to know that part of ourselves and make that come alive in our worship services and worship experiences. And so I look forward to continuing this conversation because I think that um, creative liturgy is what keeps people engaged. It's what keeps people feeling like their stories are being heard. It's what will keep us, part of what will keep us rooted in joy um, as we are, continually living in this kind of posture of resistance for however long we'll be in this posture of resistance.
Yeah.
And so, thank you for giving us some stepping stones and some tools to think about how to do that and how to nurture those spaces in our faith communities. I think that it will be absolutely essential as we move forward in this work. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for joining us. I appreciate I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, well, thank you so much for everything.
Thank you. Y'all take care.
Okay, thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye bye.